One morning in late August, as the giant tarps were slowly pulled back, the Gordie Howe International Bridge emerged, towering in the fresh sunlight. Spanning more than 2.5 kilometers and linking Detroit, USA, with Windsor, Canada, this bridge was hailed as North America's new commercial lifeline. Construction began in 2018 with a total investment exceeding $5 billion, and the bridge was seen not just as an infrastructure project, but as a symbol of cooperation, trust, and shared ambition between two nations that had stood side by side for over 70 years. The 2025 inauguration was filled with flags, fireworks, and glowing tributes to a new era of connection. But the joy had barely settled before an unexpected political and economic earthquake struck. A barrage of breaking news from Washington cast a shadow over the celebratory mood. Suddenly, people no longer saw the bridge solely as a trade route. It became a mirror reflecting the growing fractures in the two countries' relationship. It still stood tall, solid in steel and concrete, but swirling around it were doubts. Was this once unshakable alliance now beginning to falter? The question arose, how could a $5 billion bridge meant to symbolize unity become the center of a geopolitical firestorm? The answer began with a shocking decision in March 2025, when, out of Washington, a thunderbolt of tariffs was unleashed, turning the newly inaugurated bridge into a symbol of uncertainty and division. And that marked the beginning of a jolt that would come to be known as the tariff from Washington. In March 2025, what began as an ordinary morning suddenly turned into a nightmare for North America's industrial sector. With just a brief statement from the White House, the U.S. President announced a 25% tariff on cars and auto parts imported from Canada and Mexico, citing national security as the reason. The words may have sounded dry, but the impact rippled out like a shockwave. Assembly plants in Detroit, Ohio, and Michigan, all reliant on a constant flow of cross-border components, were instantly thrown into disarray. Production lines that once ran 24 hours a day came to a halt, shifts were cut, and workers faced the looming threat of layoffs. The once bustling atmosphere at the border turned gray and heavy. The Gordie Howe Bridge, a brand new source of pride, expected to ease trade pressure and open the door to a brighter future, had become the site of hushed, worried conversations. Was the $5 billion spent on its construction now turning into a monument of doubt? Trucks still crossed the bridge as usual, but every container now carried the weight of new and burdensome taxes. A long-anticipated trade corridor had, in an instant, become a stark reminder of a harsh reality. Politics can shake even the most solid structures. This tariff wasn't just an economic blow. It was a cold political message. It signaled that Washington was willing to turn trade into a weapon, regardless of the promises and agreements that had long been the foundation of an allied relationship. For many Canadians, the shock wasn't just about soaring component costs or lost export contracts. It struck a deeper nerve. The painful feeling of being disregarded, of being cast under the giant shadow of their southern neighbor. Yet, while public outrage surged and factories reeled, an unusual silence settled over Ottawa. Amid the storm, Prime Minister Mark Carney chose not to respond with fiery rhetoric. Instead, he quietly began crafting a strategy named One Canadian Economy, a declaration that this nation would no longer live in dependency's shadow, but could stand tall on its own. And that was when the real battle began. While Washington buzzed with bold declarations and politically charged tweets, Ottawa chose a different path. Quiet, but resolute. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister who once served as central bank governor for both the UK and Canada, knew that words alone wouldn't shift the balance. What was needed was a strategy, a plan to turn crisis into opportunity, and he called it One Canadian Economy. The name sounded simple, but it carried a profound message. Canada no longer wished to stand in America's shadow. For decades, Canada's industries had been deeply entwined with cross-border supply chains, treating the U.S. as its default market. Now, Carney sought to change that mindset. Rather than passively waiting for Washington to dictate the rules, Ottawa would proactively restructure the economy to reduce dependency and explore new directions. At the heart of the plan was the Dynamic Trade Response Mechanism, a flexible trade response system that allowed Canada to automatically adjust tariffs in real time based on U.S. actions. If Washington imposed a tax, Ottawa would respond immediately. No long negotiations, no diplomatic red tape. It was not only a showcase of Canada's digital capabilities in trade management, but also a clear statement. Canada was ready to play hardball. Alongside that, Carney unveiled a $10 billion CAD support package for domestic businesses. But this wasn't a no-strings-attached bailout. The key requirement was a domestic sourcing clause. To qualify, companies had to commit to using Canadian-made steel, aluminum, and components. This policy served both as a shield against the tariff blow and as an incentive to revive local industries, long overshadowed by the U.S. From factories in Ontario to small steel workshops along the St. Lawrence River, a spark of revival began to take hold. Canadians began to feel the shift, from a nation bracing for impact to one mounting a confident counterattack. Carney didn't rally crowds with slogans, but every step he took planted seeds of belief that Canada could rewrite its own economic destiny. Meanwhile, across the border in the industrial heart of America, the cracks began to show. From foundries in Michigan to small diners in Windsor, the tariff shock was no longer just numbers on a spreadsheet. It had become a pain felt in every household, and that was the price Detroit, the symbol of American industry, had to pay. Detroit, once hailed as the steel heart of America, was now the place feeling the sharpest tremors of the tariff shock. When Washington imposed the 25% tariff on cars and components imported from Canada, the ripple effects spread through every street and factory. Assembly lines that had once moved with clockwork precision came to a sudden halt. Shifts were slashed. Thousands of workers were sent home early, carrying with them heavy, anxious eyes. The much-celebrated just-in-time supply chain, long praised as a global efficiency marvel, now felt like a game of chance, where a single broken link could bring the whole system crashing down. Family-owned foundries in Michigan, which had survived on contracts supplying parts to major automakers, began shuttering one after another. For sale signs took the place of the once deafening hum of machinery, and as the factories went dark, the dominoes began to fall throughout the community. At a small diner in Windsor, business dropped by a third within weeks. Plant workers no longer came by for their usual post-shift meals. Burgers and coffee, once simple staples of working-class life, had turned into luxuries. The mood in Detroit grew heavy. Roads once jammed with traffic now felt eerily quiet. Local newspapers ran bitter headlines, "Tariffs shake the heart of American industry." Residents began to ask, does the government truly understand the price we're paying? One decision made in Washington was now weighing on the backs of the very people, the workers, the families, who built America with their hands and their hours. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Gordie Howe Bridge, Canadians were not only holding steady, they were beginning to rise. Ottawa saw this not just as a test of endurance, but as a rare chance to reshape the economy. From steel to clean energy, and especially the emerging dream of green hydrogen, Canada was taking bold new steps. And out of this crisis, a new chapter in the trade conflict was being written. Canada didn't take long to prove it wasn't just playing defense. As Washington raised tariffs, Ottawa swiftly pivoted, transforming crisis into an opportunity to reshape its economy. First up was the steel industry, long viewed by the U.S. as a weak spot to control. The Carney government announced massive infrastructure projects built entirely with domestic steel, from highways and bridges to modern rail lines. Steel mills in Ontario and Quebec, once struggling against cheap imports, now roared back to life, running around the clock and creating tens of thousands of new jobs. This wasn't just the revival of an industry. It was a clear message. Canada could nourish its own industrial strength. But the push didn't stop there. Ottawa launched the most ambitious plan in its history, to build a national green hydrogen corridor spanning the entire country. With vast resources of wind, water, and land, Canada was determined to become the clean energy hub of the 21st century. From Newfoundland to Alberta, wind and solar farms were connected to massive electrolysis plants, producing zero-emission hydrogen. What made it especially powerful was a strict origin policy. Every component and piece of technology had to be made in Canada. That policy became a mirror held up to the US. American companies hoping to do business in Canada now had to disclose their full supply chains, and many shipments were turned away for failing to meet the new standards. Meanwhile, Canadian firms were expanding outward, capturing new markets in Europe and Asia. Even the fishing industry, once seen as a traditional and static sector, reaped the benefits. Containers of Canadian lobster began arriving in Paris, Tokyo, and Seoul, one after another, while American fishermen watched dismayed as their markets slipped away. This counteroffensive strategy didn't just help Canada stay afloat, it launched the country into a breakout position, turning a defensive move into a powerful strike. And among all the ripple effects, none sent more shockwaves than the Lobster War, where a humble crustacean became a geopolitical chess piece, determining the livelihood of tens of thousands of families on both sides of the Atlantic. Few could have predicted that a seafood delicacy, often reserved for elegant dinners, would become the centerpiece of a global trade war. When the US tightened its tariffs, European and Asian markets flung their doors open to Canada. Lobsters from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland were warmly welcomed in Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, and even Beijing. Revenues soared by billions of dollars. Canadian fishermen rejoiced over stable prices, boats sailed out daily, and port towns bustled with a vibrancy not seen in years. Canadian lobster had become more than a meal. It was now a symbol of a nation that knew how to turn crisis into opportunity. Across the border, the mood was far grimmer. In Maine, lobster fishermen plunged into despair. Over 40% of their traditional export market vanished in just a few months. Freezers overflowed with unsold stock. Boats sat idle in overcrowded harbors. A man in his 60s, the third generation in his family to fish these waters, choked back tears as he admitted, "For the first time in 80 years, my family can't make a living from the sea." This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was the collapse of a tradition, the unraveling of a community that had once taken pride in its maritime heritage, now paralyzed by policy. American newspapers dubbed it the Lobster War, a phrase tinged with both bitterness and irony. Because in this battle, quality didn't determine the winner. Diplomacy and market access did. Canada skillfully secured deals with the European Union, leveraging trade agreements to widen its reach, while the US effectively tied its own hands with protectionist policies. Lobster, once a humble coastal product, had become a geopolitical pawn, one where the winner claimed not just higher profits, but a stronger position on the world stage. And from those crates of lobsters packed into shipping containers, the story didn't stop at trade. It echoed all the way to the G7 summit table, where, for the first time in decades, Canada no longer appeared as the loyal junior partner trailing behind the US, but as a confident counterweight ready to stand tall in front of its most powerful ally. At the G7 summit in the summer of 2025, the moment that captured the world's attention wasn't a photo-op handshake. It was when Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood up and openly challenged the US's economic proposal right in the middle of the plenary session. His voice, calm but firm, rang out, "We can no longer accept a trade order where the rules are written by one side and the rest are simply expected to comply." The room fell silent. Canada, long accustomed to playing a modest role, was now a nation unafraid to speak as an equal, face to face with Washington. That statement wasn't just diplomatic theater. It marked a shift in the balance of power. For decades, Ottawa had shaped its policies to stay in step with American priorities. But now, through decisive actions in steel trade, green hydrogen, and even the so-called Lobster War, Canada had shown that it could chart its own course. Support from Europe and Japan at the summit only reinforced this new standing. Canada was no longer the little brother up north, but a strategic counterweight within the Allied bloc. For Canadians, the image of Carney standing shoulder to shoulder and even toe-to-toe with Washington was a moment of pride. It symbolized not just political strength, but the quiet resilience of a country that dared to turn crisis into opportunity. A nation once labeled dependent was now one the United States had to take seriously. And yet, while the image of a proud, assertive Canada spread across the globe, back home, another symbol told a more complicated story. The Gordie Howe Bridge, the $5 billion structure connecting Detroit and Windsor, still stood tall, with both Canadian and American flags fluttering at its peak. It had been inaugurated with soaring speeches about cooperation and a shared future. But behind the grandeur, cracks in the reality had begun to show. Traffic flow was lower than forecast. Revenue was falling short of covering costs, and ongoing tariffs had rendered the trade bridge something of an orphan, stranded in the middle of a political fault line. A symbol once meant to embody unity now reflected the growing divide between two neighbors drifting further apart. On the day the Gordie Howe Bridge was inaugurated, both banks of the Detroit River lit up with fireworks and floodlights. U.S. and Canadian leaders cut the ceremonial ribbon to thunderous applause, their flags fluttering side by side, a vibrant symbol of cross-border friendship. It was hailed as the monument to North American free trade, a new gateway for goods, services, and shared dreams of integration. But just months later, that celebratory spirit had given way to a far more sobering reality. Statistics revealed that traffic across the bridge had reached only 2/3 of the original projections. The steady stream of freight, once envisioned between Detroit and Windsor, had slowed, with many containers stalled due to new tariff regulations. Revenue fell short of covering operating costs, and the government had to step in with subsidies to prevent the bridge from running at a loss. Ironically, a $5 billion project built to relieve trade bottlenecks was now becoming a financial burden. The paradox deepened as people began to see the bridge not just in economic terms, but as a political metaphor. On one hand, it still stood as a beacon of connection, a testament to shared determination and partnership. But on the other, conflicting trade policies had turned it into a visible divide, a stark reminder of the growing distance between two countries once considered unshakable allies. People in Detroit looked toward Windsor with growing unease, while Canadians crossing the bridge couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of defensiveness, as if walking into a space no longer as welcoming as it once was. And so the Gordie Howe Bridge became a double-edged symbol, a bridge to the future and a mirror reflecting present-day fractures. It stands tall in the river, but surrounding it are unspoken questions. Is this the failure of a grand project, or the sign of something deeper, a fundamental shift in the US-Canada relationship? The answer lies in the broader picture, because this is no longer just a story about a bridge or a set of tariffs. It's about a changing order, a slow drift from deep integration toward the risk of division, from warm handshakes to cautious, calculated steps. And within that shift, a larger question begins to echo. After 7 decades, is the North American order still intact, or is it quietly entering a new era? For more than 3/4 of a century, the foundation of North America rested on a shared belief in free trade and seamless supply chains. Highways, rail lines, and cross-border pipelines didn't just move goods, they carried an idea that the US, Canada, and Mexico formed a tightly woven bloc, resilient and hard to break. But then a single tweet from Washington shook that foundation. The 25% tariffs weren't just aimed at steel or automobiles. They struck at something far more fragile than any weld on the Gordie Howe Bridge: trust. Canada, once the dependent neighbor, chose the path of self-reliance. It built an automatic trade response mechanism, rebuilt its steel industry, launched a green hydrogen corridor, and expanded seafood and agricultural exports to Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, the US, instead of leading, isolated itself with short-sighted decisions, leaving allies confused and rivals quietly pleased. The once shared rules of the game gave way to fragmented moves, where every country scrambled to protect its own interests. From cars, steel, and lobsters to the negotiating table at the G7, these pieces came together to form a larger picture. The North American order is no longer what it used to be. People are beginning to ask, are these two neighboring nations, once hailed as natural allies, slowly drifting into strategic rivalry? The divide didn't happen overnight, but it crept in, through each decision, each tariff, each canceled deal. History teaches us that once trust begins to crack, no amount of concrete or steel can hold things together. And perhaps the Gordie Howe Bridge, standing tall over the Detroit River, will forever remain a painful question carved into steel. Will North America move forward in unity or lose its way in division, only to witness the birth of a new order? The Gordie Howe Bridge still stands, firm, unyielding in the flow of the Detroit River, a testament to the strength of steel, concrete, and human ambition. And yet, behind that solid frame lies a bitter paradox. Politics and short-term interests can shake even the most seemingly unshakable foundations. A structure built to unite two nations has, in the end, become a symbol of the widening gap between them. In the wake of the shock, Canada found its own path. From steel to green hydrogen to lobster, the country proved it was no longer the little brother standing in America's shadow. Meanwhile, Washington, through a series of sudden decisions, has left even its oldest ally questioning its reliability. The lesson of the century could not be clearer. No alliance is eternal without trust and mutual respect. The future of North America remains an open question. Will these two nations reaffirm their spirit of unity or drift further down the road of divergence? A $5 billion bridge may stand for centuries, but the friendship between the US and Canada is far more fragile, and it can only endure if nurtured with goodwill and long-term vision. If you have thoughts on this story, let us know in the comments below. Do you believe the US and Canada will remain close partners, or are they slowly becoming rivals? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth analysis on the forces shaping our world today.